Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to be discussing biocontrol in the brassica system, cole plants such as cabbage, kale, broccoli, and cauliflower. In particular, I'm going to focus on biological control in urban agriculture, where I'm based in Chicago, Illinois. In the Chicago area, like many Midwestern cities, there's a lot of vacant space that is now present. This is the result from deindustrialization and economic pressures that have allowed more open space to be available. And there's a movement to try to use some of this open space in development for agriculture. This is useful on an economic level because it can provide employment for low-income individuals who may live nearby. It's also a source of local food production for individuals who may live in food deserts and wouldn't have access to fresh produce otherwise. And in addition, these urban agriculture sites may be ecologically productive in adding plants and insect diversity compared to their previous uses, where they were simply vacant and unmanaged. Now, although urban farming may seem out of place compared to when we think of farming, it's actually quite a significant part across some of the developing parts of the world. A recent study pegged about 15% of farming to occur in urban areas, both in the United States and beyond. But there's some challenges to agriculture in urban spaces. Pest control can certainly be an issue. For non-organic producers, there's the issue of people living nearby and being nosy, not wanting to know what's happening. Even for organic producers, you have an issue with the scale of agriculture and there being a lack of data for smaller farms. Most of the data is applicable to the rural system, and there's really not much that's known about pest and natural enemy activity within an urban setting. So before collecting any data, I created a survey about insect pest damage, sent this out to 13 urban farm managers in the Chicago area, and asked them about pest damage within their crops and what they do to control it. I found that most of these urban growers, they do follow organic practices. Only a few sites are actually certified organically, and the reason for that lower number of certified sites is just a lack of knowledge about the certification process. Some of these farm managers don't speak English as their first language. They're not familiar with the system for obtaining certification. Others don't produce enough produce. I believe it's $5,000 now that's necessary to apply for certification. But most of these growers indicated that they use a suite of cultural and biological controls, in particular BT and neem oil, as well as hand-picking insects off the crop. For the latter one, this can be quite labor-intensive and likely not feasible for the larger urban farms. So we're interested to try to understand about the natural enemies, the good beneficial insects that might be able to control insect pests. As another part of this survey, I asked growers to tell me what the level of damage is to various crops that are grown on their farms. So we have a list of common plants that are grown. The second column is the percent of gardens that are growing this type of plant. And the final column is the average damage that growers report. It's on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 being less damage, 5 being more. And I bolded the values over 2. This correlated to over 25% of leaf or stem area was damaged. And in particular, cole crops in the brassica, such as cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower, as well as cucurbits and cucumber and squash, tended to be the most susceptible to insect pests in these urban settings. Although cucumber and squash have greater amounts of insect pest damage, there are fewer natural enemies for them. In particular, cucumber beetle is a hard one to control with natural enemies, so I decided to focus on brassica plants, which have a pest complex with no natural enemies. So there's 3 main insect pests that attack brassica. Collectively, they're called cabbage worms, and the 3 include imported cabbage worm, which is a white butterfly that's active in the daytime and ubiquitous across almost all sites. There's also cabbage looper and diamondback moth, which are more earthy in color, and they are nocturnal. About 90% of the growers indicated that they have imported cabbage worm. Fewer noticed cabbage looper or diamondback moth. I think part of that is because they are active at night. They weren't as familiar with them, at least in the adult stage. But nonetheless, imported cabbage worm is the major pest of brassica plants within the Chicago area and likely in other Midwestern farm systems too. But the adult is not the life stage that damages the plant. Let's go over the life cycle of the cabbage worm briefly. Of course, the adults can have multiple generations per year in this region, in Chicago and Wisconsin, and they lay eggs, which are very small and laid singly on the leaf surface. If you have a good eye, you might have noticed this before this circle illuminated it. They're hard to scout for because they're so tiny, but once the eggs hatch, they become more visible as larvae, which are the solid circles, and the larvae will feed on the plant for 2 to 3 weeks. During that time, they may feed quite voraciously in their later instars, and you'll see that there are holes around here, on another leaf surface as well, and if left unchecked, defoliation can be quite severe, and if the foliage of the crop is what's being sold, it may be unmarketable. And then I have the pupa as well, which is also recognizable in the dashed lines. Another insect pest in cabbage worm that I want to point out are aphids. Although I'm not talking about aphids in today's talk, they are an important pest, especially later in the growing season in this region. By the end of August, they may congregate in up to several hundred aphids below the leaf surface, and at that amount of aphid pressure, the plant can be stressed, and there could be damage to leaf tissue and potentially leaf death. And before I get into the research objectives, I just want to point out that some work about parasitism of cabbage worms. So what's known now is that parasitoid wasps tend to be an effective natural enemy of cabbage worms. So these parasitoid wasps, they lay their eggs inside the larval or egg stages of the cabbage worm. The eggs hatch, and they feed on the cabbage worm alive. It's not a pretty thing if you're the cabbage worm, but in the process, it kills the cabbage worm, and then those maturing eggs from the parasitic wasp, they then develop into adults, and you have more parasitic wasps and more natural enemies that occur. So this chart is showing levels of parasitism by the levels of parasitism against the 3 cabbage worm species I mentioned. This was collected in rural Minnesota about 10 years ago. And you can see that there is interannual variation in parasitism, but for the 2 most common species in our study system, imported cabbage worm and cabbage looper, which are the circles, both open and closed, parasitism rates average about 30% per year. And we know that there's probably other natural enemies too, so that's another question that we're going to address. So the first objective was to first establish some baseline data. So who's out there? What are the levels of cabbage worm pests on urban plants? The natural enemy populations, are there natural enemies even at these urban sites? And also we set up an assay to examine the rate of biocontrol, so how many eggs are damaged. And we compared this by the scale of urban agriculture. And I'll talk more about scale in the next slide. The second objective is applicable to our non-urban growers as well, and we wanted to understand how efficient are different natural enemies at consuming cabbage looper eggs. So we have multiple natural enemy species, but are they consuming the same number of eggs, and is one better than the other as a biocontrol agent? And finally, bringing it back to the urban system, we wanted to understand if the level of urbanization impacts pests and natural enemies. Some research from my PhD has looked at insect population patterns across an urban gradient, and we've done some work on pollinators, and we want to understand if there's similar patterns where the amount of urbanization might impact pest and natural enemy populations. So the first question, we classified urban agriculture into 3 sites. So there's residential gardens, where people are growing for personal consumption, only a few plants. Community gardens, the scale is increased, but you have multiple individuals managing their plants in different ways, often for personal consumption, but sometimes sold commercially. And then finally, urban farms, which is what we'd be most familiar with when we talk about a farm. In the Chicago area, these range from about half an acre to 7 acres, managed by a single individual or an individual with multiple volunteers, but through a single management regime. Now, for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus primarily on the community gardens and urban farms. where plants are sold commercially, generally through CSAs, farmers markets, sometimes beyond the urban area as well. And we predicted that in these urban farm sites, which have greater crop intensity, there's likely to also be a greater amount of pests. So we wanted to confirm this. So to do this, we sampled for pests and natural enemies at about 17 sites. We used these yellow sticky cards, which you can see in the left and right. We set them up from June to August, and we replace them every other week. So these sticky cards collect natural enemies, and it's a way to identify the amount of natural enemies across the entire growing season from seedling stage until the crop is mature. And as we replaced the sticky cards, we also estimated defoliation on the plant and counted the number of cabbage worm eggs, larvae, and adults on a subset of leaves within each garden. For the biocontrol aspect of this project, we obtained cabbage looper larvae, which you can see on the left side. We used the later instar, which is the one right in front of the nickel. We also used cabbage worm eggs, and we affixed them beneath this cardstock, which was painted green on the bottom side. So the cardstock is supposed to be representative of a leaf, and we left these larvae and eggs out at each site for 2 72-hour periods, and the idea was we're presenting an insect pest to natural enemies, and we wanted to identify how many of these eggs and larvae were attacked. So after 72 hours, we brought them back to the lab, we assessed the level of damage, and we did the same for our natural enemies on these yellow sticky cards. It takes a lot of hours to identify bugs on 580 sticky cards. Still going over a couple of them. But most of them are lady beetles, minute pirate bug in the lower right corner, and parasitoid wasps in the lower left. These are the primary natural enemies that we were finding. So for the first objective, we did indeed find that at these farms that have greater amounts of brassica being grown, there are a greater number of pests too. And this is a significant relationship. So for both eggs at the farm scale, larvae at the farm scale, and adults at the farm scale, there's a greater number of all three life stages of cabbage worms compared to community or private gardens. This is logical. There's more plants for the pests to feed on, so there's going to be more pests. But this just affirms that urban farms should recognize that these pests are an issue at their sites as well. The plus side to this is that where there are pests, there's also natural enemies. And the same relationship held where at urban farms we found significantly greater numbers of natural enemies compared to our private and community gardens. So if someone is a community garden operator, that might be somewhere where I'd be a bit worried in terms of obtaining biocontrol from natural enemies, because we were finding significantly less natural enemies there compared to farms. Most of these natural enemies were parasitic wasps. They're quite tiny, sometimes only about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters in length. So just to give you a sense of their scale, this is a wild parsnip. This is a parasitic wasp right there. And included in these parasitic wasps were some specialist wasps. So what you're looking at in this square is a parasitized imported cabbage worm. So there's a couple species of parasitic wasps that lay their eggs exclusively in imported cabbage worm and cabbage looper. So right here, these white things are the pupae that have emerged from the cabbage worm. So from one parasitic wasp, there's going to be anywhere from 20 to 50 parasitic wasps that will emerge. And interestingly, we also found that native lady beetles were more abundant at farms, which might suggest that these farms might be a type of ecological restoration in urban areas when you compare them to the other type of habitat around them, as they're attracting more native lady beetles compared to the exotic multi-spotted Asian lady beetle, which is normally quite common. Now for the second objective, we found biocontrol was equal across garden scales, and I want to bring up a clip. So what you're looking at is a time-lapse camera that's focused on our cabbage worm egg mass, and those little black things are ants. So we set up time-lapse cameras beneath a subset of these biocontrol assays, and we observed insects that were actually feeding on the cabbage worm eggs. This confirmed that the insects that we found on the cards are indeed feeding on some of these cabbage worms as well. In this case, the ants were feeding for well over an hour at this one site, and we found ants, lady beetle larvae, parasitic wasps, and spiders that fed on cabbage worm eggs. In terms of larvae, we didn't catch anything feeding on them, so biocontrol is likely more important at the egg stage. It's important to have insect predators and parasitic wasps that are feeding on eggs rather than larvae. So, having confirmed that there are natural enemies present and that they do indeed feed on cabbage worms, we then ask, well, how good are these natural enemies at feeding on cabbage worms? So to do this, we set up a lab experiment. So in these petri dishes, we put an egg mass of cabbage looper, and then in each petri dish, we put in different natural enemies. So one petri dish might have a lady beetle, one petri dish might have a pirate bug, and we left them in there for 24 hours and then measured the percent of consumed eggs. What we found was quite interesting, that lady beetle, adults and larvae, are voracious eaters of cabbage looper eggs. So they consumed about 100% of eggs on average. I think it was about 95 for larvae and 99 for adults. And this was much greater than the next most efficient lady beetle, the next most efficient natural enemy, which is pirate bugs. I also want to point out that for harvestmen, also known as daddy longlegs, and spiders, these are ground-dwelling insects. Now we included them, but from a separate experiment we found that unless you're growing your crops directly in the ground, you're not likely to have any ground-dwelling insect predators. So for those urban farmers that are growing in raised beds, spiders and harvestmen are virtually absent. And for pests that you normally have biocontrol agents that live in the soil, they're not likely to be present in raised beds. And then finally, we looked at the level of urbanization to identify how this impacts insect populations. So we know that when you think about a city, it's not uniform in terms of all pavement and houses. There's some parts of cities, such as the picture on the left, the more outlying areas, where you might have a community garden or urban farm, and there's less development around it. There's open space. In this case, there's actually a 3-acre prairie nearby. And then, of course, you have a farm such as this one, which is only about a half mile from Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. About as urban as you can get. And we thought this question might be interesting based on some previous work in our lab. So this is a paper that we published last year. And what this is showing is that in areas that are more densely populated, so these are census block groups, the darker block groups indicate that there's more people living there. The lighter ones means that there's less people living there. And we found that there's actually more bees. So this circle represents an area where we sampled for bees. So you can see these areas where there's more people near Lake Michigan and also in this area, there actually are more bees because people in these areas with more are putting flowers in the ground and in effect attracting bees. So we wanted to know if maybe this holds true for other insects as well. It didn't for natural enemies, but that's not a bad thing necessarily. This graph shows one of the few natural enemies that did have a significant relationship. It was the opposite, actually. So the x-axis is grass cover around farms. So with more grass cover around farms, meaning when you have more grass cover, less development pressure, there were more of these long-legged flies. These are a group of natural enemies that feed on aphids primarily. But for the rest of the natural enemies, there was no effect. So natural enemies were present irrespective of population density or grass cover, which might be a good thing because this means that natural enemies are present across the urban gradient and they're not more common at sites either farther or closer to the urban center. But what's good news for our urban farmers is that we found reduced levels of pest damage at sites that are closer to the urban center. So as population density on the x-axis increases, there's a lower number of cabbage worm eggs. For cabbage worm larvae, there was a trend of reduced number of larvae, but it wasn't significant. And this seems logical because these cabbage worms primarily feed on brassica plants. And since there's less brassica closer to the city center in more developed areas, there's less food for these cabbage worms and also less cabbage worms. In terms of biocontrol, the percentage of eggs that were damaged, we found that more eggs were damaged in areas closer to the urban center. So when there's less grass cover, more eggs are likelier to be damaged. So this seems like a win-win for urban farmers, because if your farm is closer to downtown or even within an urban area, you have less insect pests on your cabbage plant, less damage to your plant, at least from cabbage worms, and at the same time, when cabbage worms are present, the natural enemies are doing a better job at attacking them. And this is likely because since there are less pest items closer to the urban center, these natural enemies are hungrier, so to speak. So they'll feed on anything that comes in their path, compared to more outlying sites where there's a greater availability of insect hosts, and the natural enemies might be choosier and may not have fed on cabbage looper at the same rate. So some take-home points from some of the work in this study is that natural enemies are present across all urban farms. Biocontrol is likely to happen from different types of natural enemies in Brassica. Although it's primarily parasitic wasps that we found in these sticky cards, we also found other natural enemies that are known to feed on cabbage worms. So there were lady beetles present, and those specialist wasps that exclusively feed on cabbage worm. But we need to do further work to evaluate if these patterns that we found in the lab, where lady beetles are extremely good eaters of cabbage worms, do they hold true in the field as well? Because many of us might know that lady beetles tend to feed on aphids. And if there's aphids in a cabbage field, will they avoid the cabbage looper and just go to the aphids? So there's not much data related to that question, and that's something that needs to be quantified in the field. But one of the good points for urban growers is, although they face challenges in terms of land acquisition and ownership, when they are able to actually farm on the land, they may experience reduced insect pest damage. So in fact, they could be at an advantage for reducing damage because there's less cabbage worms. Natural enemies are present across the entire area, and in those sites that are closer to more developed areas, more cabbage worms are being consumed. Just want to acknowledge some of the funders for this project, including the Ceres Trust, our field assistants, and then, of course, the growers who let me sample and collect data at their sites. And there's time for questions. I'll take a couple questions.